You see light constantly. It fills your world without asking permission. It defines edges, reveals color, gives shape to everything you believe is real. A lamp in your room, the glow of a screen, the soft light from the sky above you. All of it feels immediate, continuous, and undeniably present. And because it feels that way, you've likely never questioned the simplest assumption behind it. That light is somewhere. Somewhere between the moment it leaves a source and the moment it reaches your eyes. It seems obvious, almost too obvious to even think about. A beam leaves a lamp, travels across the room, and arrives. You can trace it in your mind like a line drawn through space. If you could pause time, you might imagine that line frozen in place, with light sitting neatly along it, occupying each point step by step. But that image, clear, intuitive, and deeply familiar, hides a quiet problem, because it assumes that light behaves like the things you interact with every day. Objects that exist in one place at a time. Objects that move by passing through every point in between. Light doesn't quite follow those rules. The deeper you look, the more that simple path begins to dissolve. Experiments don't show light neatly traveling like a tiny particle moving from one location to another. Instead, they reveal something far less comfortable, something that refuses to settle into a single, well-defined position unless something forces it to. Until that moment, its location becomes strangely difficult to describe, not hidden, not unknown, but undefined. And that distinction matters more than it seems, because if light does not have a clear position while it is on its way to you, then the question shifts. It's no longer just about where light is. It becomes a question of whether that where exists at all. Right now, as you sit here, light is moving toward your eyes from every direction, from the walls, from objects around you, from distant sources you are not even aware of. Your brain quietly assembles all of it into a stable image, giving you the feeling that everything is simply there. But between those sources and your perception, there is a gap, a space we almost never think about. And inside that space, something strange is happening. Because what you see as a smooth, continuous journey may not be a journey in the way you imagine. And if that's true, then before light is seen, it may not be anywhere at all. When you imagine light traveling, your mind does something very natural. It draws a path, a clean, continuous line stretching from a source to your eyes, as if light were a tiny object sliding along a perfectly defined route through space. You can almost see it in your head, a beam leaving a lamp, crossing the room, touching surfaces, arriving exactly where it's supposed to go. It feels so intuitive that questioning it almost seems unnecessary. But that mental image is not something you've ever actually observed. It's something your brain constructs to make sense of what it receives. Because what you truly experience is not the journey of light, but only its arrival. You never see light in transit as a complete process. You only see the result, the moment it interacts with something, the moment it reaches your eyes, the moment it becomes part of your perception. Everything in between is an assumption, and that assumption begins to break the moment we try to examine it closely. In physics, especially at the quantum level, light does not behave like a small object following a single, well-defined path. When experiments are designed to detect where light is while it travels, the results become unsettling. Instead of revealing a clear trajectory, they show something far more diffuse, almost as if the idea of a single path simply doesn't apply. Light does not commit to one route unless it is forced to. Until that moment, describing it as being here or there becomes increasingly difficult. One of the simplest ways to begin feeling this is to imagine trying to track a single photon as it moves through space. Not a beam, not a glow, but one individual packet of light. Where is it exactly at any given moment? You might try to assign it a position, to place it somewhere along the path you've imagined. But the moment you try to verify that position, something changes. The act of checking forces an interaction, and that interaction alters the very behavior you are trying to observe. So instead of revealing a hidden path, the universe gives you a different answer. It refuses to define one. And this is where the familiar picture begins to unravel. Because if light does not occupy a single, continuous line through space while it travels, then the path, you imagine, is not something that physically exists in the way you think it does. It's a useful story, a model that works well at large scales, but underneath it lies something far less concrete, something that doesn't move from point to point in the way objects do. Instead, it behaves more like a set of possibilities, spread out across space, only becoming specific when something demands that it does. And until that moment, until it interacts, until it is detected, until it is seen, the question of where it is does not have a simple answer waiting in the background, because there may be no single answer at all. And if there is no single path, no defined position, no clear trajectory, then the space between source and observer is not what it appears to be. It is not a corridor that light passes through. It is something much stranger, a place where the idea of where begins to lose its meaning. If light does not follow a single path, then what replaces that idea is not empty space, but something far more difficult to picture. Because in place of a defined trajectory, physics gives us a description that spreads light out, not as a solid object, but as a kind of presence that extends across many possible locations at once. Not in the sense that it is physically duplicated in the way objects would be, but in the sense that its behavior cannot be reduced to one point in space until something forces that reduction to happen. This is where the idea of locality begins to weaken. In everyday life, everything you interact with is local. A chair is in one place. Your hand is in one place. If something moves, it travels through the space in between. At every moment, it occupies a specific position. That assumption is so deeply built into your thinking that it feels inseparable from reality itself. But light, at its most fundamental level, does not fully obey that rule. Instead of being confined to a single location, it is described by a distribution, a spread of possibilities that exist simultaneously. And while that might sound abstract, it has very real consequences. Because if light is not strictly localized while it travels, then asking, "Where is it right now?" becomes less like asking for a hidden coordinate, and more like asking a question that the universe does not answer in the way you expect. It's not that the position is unknown, waiting to be discovered. It's that the position is not defined in the way you're imagining. To feel how strange this is, consider the difference between something being hidden and something not existing in a particular form. If you place an object in a box, you may not know exactly where it is inside, but you still assume it has a definite position. It exists somewhere, even if you can't see it. But with light, before it interacts, that assumption begins to fail. There is no single somewhere quietly waiting behind the scenes. There is only a range of possibilities. And those possibilities are not just mathematical conveniences. They are the most accurate way we have to describe what light is doing before it is observed. They determine how it will behave when it finally does interact. They shape the probabilities of where it can appear, but they do not collapse into a single outcome until that interaction takes place. So in a very real sense, before light is seen, it is not located in one place. It is distributed across many, not as multiple separate copies, but as a single entity whose existence is not confined to a single point in space. And that challenges something deeper than just how we picture motion. It challenges the idea that existence itself must always be tied to a specific location. Because if something can exist without being pinned to one place. Then where is no longer a simple property. It becomes something that only emerges at the moment of interaction. And until that moment arrives, light does not occupy space in the way you think it does. There is a specific moment when all of this changes, a moment so ordinary that you experience it constantly, yet so profound that it quietly defines the boundary between possibility and reality. That moment is interaction. Up until now, we've been circling around a strange idea that before light is seen, its position is not simply hidden, but undefined. That instead of moving along a clean path, it exists as a spread of possibilities, not committed to any single location. But then something happens, something that forces all of those possibilities to resolve into one outcome. Light interacts. It touches a surface. It enters your eye. It is absorbed, reflected, detected. And in that instant, the question of where suddenly has an answer. Not because the answer was always there, waiting to be revealed, but because the act of interaction creates it. This is the part that quietly overturns your intuition. We tend to think of observation as passive, as if we are simply uncovering what already exists. But at the level where light behaves this way, observation is not passive at all. It is an active event. It is a physical process that forces the system into a specific state. Before that moment, light is described by a range of possibilities. After that moment, it is found in a definite place, and nothing in between ever existed in the way you imagined. To feel how radical this is, imagine trying to assign a position to light before it reaches your eyes. You might picture it halfway across the room, suspended in space, quietly continuing its journey. But that picture assumes that the journey is made of defined steps, each with its own location. Physics does not confirm that picture. Instead, it tells you that until light interacts, there is no single point you can meaningfully assign to it. There is no hidden coordinate marking its progress. There is no precise location it occupies as it moves from one place to another. There is only the potential for where it could be found when an interaction finally occurs. And when that interaction happens, something almost instantaneous takes place. The spread of possibilities resolves. The undefined becomes defined. The question of where receives an answer, but only at that exact moment. It's not that light was traveling through space with a secret position all along. It's that position itself is something that emerges when it becomes necessary, which means that the path you imagine, the smooth line connecting source to observer, is not a physical trail that light follows step by step. It is a reconstruction, a story your mind tells after the fact, stitching together cause and effect into something that feels continuous and real. But underneath that story, something far stranger is happening. Because between emission and detection, there is no sequence of defined positions linking the two. There is only a transition from possibility to outcome. And the place where that outcome appears is the only place light can truly be said to have been. We tend to think of movement as something built from steps. Even when something moves quickly, we imagine it passing through every point along the way, occupying each position for at least an instant before continuing forward. That idea is so deeply rooted in how you experience the world that it feels inseparable from motion itself. To move, something must go from here to there, by crossing everything in between. But light challenges that picture in a way that is easy to miss. Because when you try to apply that same logic to light, especially at the level of individual photons, the idea of a step-by-step journey begins to lose its foundation. Not gradually, but completely. The in-between that you rely on to define motion stops behaving like a sequence of real, occupied positions and starts behaving more like a set of possibilities that never fully solidify into actual locations. It still feels like light travels. Your entire experience depends on that feeling, but the deeper description suggests something else entirely. It suggests that what you are calling a journey is not made of steps at all. To understand why, imagine trying to freeze time and capture light mid-motion, not as a blur, not as a beam, but as a precise snapshot of where it is. You would expect to find it somewhere along its path, just like any moving object. But when physics tries to do exactly that, it runs into a problem. There is no single, well-defined position to capture. Instead, what you find is a spread, a range of possible locations, none of which can be singled out as the one true position until an interaction occurs. And the moment you force that interaction, by measuring, detecting, or observing, you are no longer looking at light in transit. You are looking at the result of that interaction. You are seeing where it ends up, not where it was in the way you imagined. So the idea of freezing light mid-journey reveals something unsettling. There may be no mid-journey in the sense you're expecting, not as a sequence of occupied points, not as a chain of positions that exist one after another. Instead, the entire concept of movement begins to shift. It becomes less about traveling through space step by step, and more about transitioning between two events, emission and detection. Everything in between does not consist of definite positions. It consists of possibilities, and those possibilities do not behave like a hidden trail waiting to be uncovered. They behave like a structure that only resolves into a single outcome when something demands that resolution. Until then, there is no single path, no precise location, no series of steps that define where light is at each moment. This reframes the journey entirely. Because if there are no steps, then the motion you imagine is not something that physically unfolds in the way you think. It is something that appears complete only when you look at the beginning and the end together. The path exists as a description after the fact, not as a sequence of real positions experienced along the way. And that means that between the moment light is created and the moment it is seen, there is no continuous trail of where. There is only the beginning and the end, and a strange, undefined space in between, where the idea of location itself has not yet taken shape. There is another way to approach this, not by asking where light is from your perspective, standing still in a world where time flows normally, but by asking what the situation looks like from the perspective of light itself. And the moment you try to do that, something even more unsettling begins to emerge, because according to relativity, light does not experience time, not slowed down, not distorted, absent. From your point of view, light leaves a distant star, travels across space for millions of years, and eventually reaches your eyes. You imagine that entire journey unfolding across time, step by step, distance by distance, as if light is continuously moving through a vast stretch of space. But from the perspective of light, if such a perspective could even be said to exist, there is no passage of time between those two events, no duration, no interval, no journey in the way you understand it. The moment light is emitted and the moment it is absorbed are not separated by time. They are, in a very real sense, the same event. And if there is no time between emission and detection, then something else quietly disappears along with it. The idea of being somewhere in between, because in between requires time. It requires a sequence. It requires moments unfolding one after another. Without time, there are no intermediate states, no halfway points, no positions that exist during a journey. There is only the start and the end, and nothing experienced in between. Now, this does not mean that light instantly appears everywhere, or that it ignores space entirely in your frame of reference. From your perspective, it still takes time to travel. You can measure that time. You can calculate distances. The universe remains consistent and predictable in that sense. But this creates a strange dual picture. From your perspective, light travels through space over time. From the perspective of light, there is no travel and no time. And when you place those two descriptions side by side, something begins to fracture in your understanding of where. Because if light does not experience the passage of time, then the idea of it occupying different positions at different moments becomes questionable. There are no different moments for it to exist in, no sequence of locations it moves through, no evolving position that defines its journey, which means that even the question, where is light before it is seen, becomes unstable, because that question assumes that there is a before in the sense of experienced time. But for light, there may be no before at all, only emission and detection. And if those two are not separated by time in any meaningful way, then the space between them is not something light moves through step by step. It is something that only exists from your point of view, a kind of stretched out illusion, created by the way time flows for you, but not for the thing you are trying to track. And that leads to a deeply counterintuitive possibility, that what you perceive as a long journey across space may not be a journey for light at all, which means that before it is seen, there may be no before in the way you imagine. If light does not follow a single path, and if it does not experience a sequence of moments the way you do, then what exists between emission and detection cannot be described as a line through space. It must be something else entirely. And the closest description physics gives us is not a path, but a structure of possibilities. This structure is often called a wave function, but the name itself can be misleading. It is not a wave in the sense of something physically rippling through space like water or sound. It is a mathematical description of all the places light could be found if an interaction were to occur. It does not tell you where light is. It tells you where it can appear. And that distinction is subtle but crucial, because instead of imagining light as occupying a specific position at each moment, you have to imagine it as being spread across many potential positions at once, not physically divided into pieces, but described in a way that includes all possible outcomes simultaneously. It is not that light is secretly in one of those positions and we simply don't know which one. It is that none of those positions are fully real in the way you expect, until something forces a choice. This means that before light is seen, what exists is not a hidden location, but a landscape of possibilities. And that landscape has a shape. Some regions are more likely than others. Some outcomes are favored, others are suppressed. The structure evolves according to precise rules, spreading, interfering, reinforcing certain possibilities while canceling others out. But at no point does it collapse into a single, definite location on its own. It remains open, unresolved. And because of that, asking, where is light, before it is observed, becomes like asking which single point in that entire landscape is the real one. The answer is not simply unknown. It is not determined. To make this more tangible, imagine a room filled with overlapping shadows of where something could be. Not solid objects, but faint outlines, each representing a possible position. None of them are fully real on their own, but together they describe the full range of what could happen. That is closer to how light exists before it is detected, not as a single point moving through space, but as a distribution that encodes many potential outcomes at once. And when an interaction finally occurs, something abrupt happens. That entire landscape collapses. All those possibilities reduce to one. Not gradually, not by narrowing down step by step, but in a single event. One location becomes real, and all the others disappear as physical outcomes. the spread of possibilities gives way to a single, definite position. And that is the moment you call seeing. So before that moment, light is not hidden somewhere along a path. It is not waiting at a specific point in space. It exists as this extended structure of possibilities without committing to any single location, which means that the question you started with, where is light before it is seen, does not have an answer in the form you expected, because before it is seen, there is no single where to point to. There is only the shape of what could be. If light exists as a spread of possibilities before it is seen, then those possibilities are not passive. They don't just sit there waiting for an outcome. They interact with each other in ways that produce real, measurable effects. And this is where things become even more difficult to reconcile with intuition, because possibilities can interfere, not objects, not particles in fixed positions, possibilities. When light moves through space without being forced into a single path, the different potential routes it could take do not remain separate. They overlap, they combine. In some regions, they reinforce each other, making certain outcomes more likely. In others, they cancel each other out, making some outcomes nearly impossible. The result is a pattern that emerges not from a single trajectory, but from the interaction of many potential ones. This is not just an abstract idea. It is something that has been observed again and again. When light is allowed to behave freely, without forcing it into a defined path, it produces patterns that can only be explained if multiple possibilities are acting together. As if light is not choosing one route, but somehow accounting for many at once. And that leads to a strange conclusion. Before it is observed, light does not behave as though it is traveling along one path. It behaves as though all possible paths are contributing to what will eventually happen. Now pause for a moment and let that settle in, because this is where the familiar idea of where begins to completely break apart. If light were truly located at a single point in space while it travels, then only one path would matter. Only one route would influence the outcome. But that is not what we see. Instead, outcomes depend on the structure of all possible paths, even those that seem indirect, unlikely, or even impossible from a classical point of view. So before light is seen, it is not just that its position is undefined. It is that its behavior reflects a kind of non-local existence, not in the sense that it is everywhere in a physical, solid way, but in the sense that its potential presence across space actively shapes what will happen when it is finally detected. The result you observe is influenced by a web of possibilities that extends beyond any single point. This changes the nature of the question completely, because now asking, where is light, is like asking which single path is real, when in fact the outcome depends on many paths working together. There is no single route you can isolate and call the true one. The entire structure contributes to what you eventually see. And when the moment of interaction arrives, all of that complexity disappears into a single event, a single point, a single outcome. But that outcome carries the imprint of everything that came before, not as a sequence of positions, but as an interaction of possibilities, which means that the location where light is finally detected is not the end of a simple journey. It is the result of something far more distributed, something that was never confined to a single place. So before light is seen, it is not traveling along a hidden path through space. It is unfolding across a network of possibilities that quietly shape the moment it finally appears. And until that moment arrives, there is no single where it can be said to occupy. There is a point where all of this begins to feel less like physics and more like a contradiction, because on one hand, you are being told that light is not in a single place before it is seen, that it does not follow a defined path, that it exists as a spread of possibilities rather than a fixed position. And yet, on the other hand, the space around you feels anything but empty. You look across a room and you don't see uncertainty. You don't see a cloud of probabilities waiting to collapse. You see objects, surfaces, edges, a stable world, continuously illuminated. It feels as though light is already there, filling the space between you and everything you perceive. So how can both of these things be true? How can light be nowhere in a defined sense, and yet everywhere in your experience? The answer lies in a subtle shift between what is physically described and what is perceptually constructed. Because what you experience as a continuous field of light is not a direct view of light existing in space. It is the result of countless interactions that have already happened. Every point you see, every surface that appears illuminated, is a place where light has already been absorbed, reflected, or detected. Your brain then assembles all of those discrete events into a seamless picture. It fills in the gaps. It creates continuity where, at a deeper level, there may be none. So the sense that light is out there, smoothly occupying the space between you and the world, is not something you are directly observing. It is something your mind constructs from the outcomes of many individual interactions. It is a reconstruction, not a direct representation of what exists before those interactions occur. And this creates a powerful illusion, an illusion of presence. It feels as though light fills space continuously, as though it exists at every point along its path before it reaches you. But what you are actually seeing are endpoints, results, moments where possibilities have already collapsed into outcomes. Everything in between remains hidden from direct experience, not because it is physically blocked, but because it does not exist in a form that can be seen. So the space between source and observer begins to take on a different character. It is not empty in the classical sense, but it is not filled with light in the way you imagine either. It is something in between, a region where light is not located as a definite entity, but is instead described by a spread of possibilities that only become real when interaction occurs. This is why the absence feels full, because your perception is built from completed events, not from the unresolved state that exists before them. Your brain never shows you the uncertainty. It only shows you the resolved outcomes, stitched together into a continuous world. And that world feels stable, solid, and complete. But underneath that stability, something very different is happening. Because before light is seen, before it interacts, before it becomes part of your perception, there is no continuous presence filling the space. There is only the potential for that presence to appear, which means that what feels like a fully illuminated world is built on something that, in a very real sense, is not there yet. There is one more layer to this illusion, and it hides in something so familiar that it almost disappears completely. Every time you see anything, you are looking into the past. Light does not arrive instantly. It takes time to travel, even across the smallest distances. The walls around you, the objects in your hands, the screen in front of you, everything you see is slightly delayed. Not enough for you to notice, but enough to matter. Enough to remind you that what you experience as now is always a reconstruction of events that have already happened. And yet, your perception feels immediate, seamless, continuous. You do not experience a delay. You do not feel like you are waiting for light to arrive. The world simply appears, fully formed, as if it exists all at once. Your brain takes these delayed signals and compresses them into a single present moment, smoothing over the gaps, removing the sense of time passing between emission and detection. So even in this very basic sense, the journey of light is hidden from you. You never experience it unfolding. You only ever experience the result. But when you combine this with everything you've already explored, something deeper begins to emerge. Because not only are you seeing the past, you are seeing the past only at the moment it becomes defined. Think about that carefully. Light leaves a source, but during its journey, its position is not clearly defined in the way you imagined. It exists as a spread of possibilities, not as a sequence of locations. Then, at the moment it interacts, at the moment it reaches your eyes, it becomes a single, definite event. And that event is what you perceive. So what you call seeing is not the observation of a continuous process. It is the detection of a final outcome. The entire journey you imagine in between is something your mind reconstructs after the fact, combining your understanding of space, time, and motion into a story that feels smooth and complete. But that story skips over something crucial. It skips over the fact that before detection, there was no single, defined position for light to occupy. No stable presence moving step by step through space. Only a range of possibilities that had not yet resolved into a specific outcome. And by the time that outcome becomes real, the journey is already over. This creates a strange inversion of how you think about reality. You assume that light exists first, travels second, and is seen last. But what you actually experience is the final step only. The moment of interaction. The moment where all the uncertainty collapses into a single, definite event. Everything before that remains outside of direct experience, described only by probabilities and possibilities, not by concrete positions in space. And because your brain builds a continuous world from those final events, it gives you the impression that light has always been there, smoothly connecting everything together. But in truth, what you are seeing is not a continuous presence. It is a series of resolved moments, assembled into something that feels like a flowing reality, which means that the delay you never notice is not just a delay in time. It is a gap in understanding, a gap between what actually happens before light is seen and the story your mind tells you about it. At this point, everything begins to circle back to a single, deceptively simple question. Where is light before it is seen? Not as a poetic idea, not as a philosophical thought experiment, but as a precise question about reality itself. A question that seems like it should have a clear answer, a location, a coordinate, a point somewhere along the space between source and observer. And yet, every layer you've explored quietly removes that possibility. First, the idea of a path begins to dissolve. Light does not behave like a tiny object moving step by step through space. It refuses to commit to a single trajectory unless something forces it to. Then, the idea of a defined position fades. Instead of occupying one place at a time, light is described as a spread of possibilities, not fully real in any single location until interaction occurs. Then, even time itself begins to shift. From the perspective of light, there is no passage of time between emission and detection, no sequence of moments, no in-between to hold a series of positions. And finally, your own perception reveals its limits. You never observe the journey. You only ever receive the result, the moment where everything resolves into something definite. So when you return to the question now, it no longer behaves the way it did at the beginning. It doesn't point to a hidden answer. It exposes a missing piece in the way the question is framed. Because asking where assumes that location is always a defined property. It assumes that for anything that exists, there must be a specific place it occupies at every moment. But light, before it is seen, does not fully obey that assumption. It does not carry a fixed position through space waiting to be revealed. It does not leave behind a continuous trail of where it has been. Instead, it exists in a state where location is not yet a single, resolved fact. And that means the question itself begins to fail. Not because it is meaningless, but because it is being asked in a language that no longer applies. It's like trying to ask, what color is silence? Or, where is a thought located before it forms? The structure of the question assumes properties that may not exist in the way you expect. And when applied to light at this level, where becomes one of those properties. Because before interaction, there is no single place that light can be said to occupy. Only a structure of possibilities. Only a range of outcomes that have not yet collapsed into one. And that leads to a quiet but profound shift. The answer to the question is not hidden somewhere deeper in space. It is not waiting to be discovered with better instruments or more precise measurements. The answer is that the question itself is pointing in the wrong direction. Because before light is seen, there is no single where for it to be. There is a moment, if you follow this far enough, where the question doesn't just become difficult, it becomes unstable. Because everything you've been using to define where, position, path, movement, even time, has slowly been stripped away. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until what remains is no longer something you can point to on a map of space. And yet, the instinct to ask the question doesn't disappear. It lingers, because your mind is built to locate things, to assign positions, to anchor everything that exists to a place. That instinct works perfectly in the world of everyday objects, where things are solid, localized, and continuous. But here, at the level where light behaves the way it does, that instinct begins to reach beyond its limits. And when it does, something subtle happens. You don't just lose the answer, you lose the meaning of the question itself. Because where only makes sense when something occupies a definite location. It requires a stable position that can be identified, even if it's hidden. It assumes that existence and location are inseparable, that if something is real, it must be somewhere. But before light is seen, that assumption no longer holds. Light still exists in a meaningful sense. It influences outcomes. It evolves according to precise rules. It carries energy. It interacts when the moment arrives. But its existence is not tied to a single, definite position in space. So when you try to force it into that framework, when you try to ask where it is, you are applying a concept that doesn't fully apply. And that's why the answers begin to feel unsatisfying. Not because they are incomplete, but because they are being filtered through a question that expects the wrong kind of answer. To understand this more clearly, imagine trying to describe a cloud of possibilities as if it were a solid object. You would be forced to pick a point, to assign a location, even though the thing you're describing is inherently spread out. No single point captures what it is. Any attempt to reduce it to one position loses essential information. That is what happens when you ask where light is before it is seen. You are trying to compress something distributed into something localized, and the result is a mismatch. So instead of asking where light is, a more accurate question might be, how is light described before it is observed? And the answer to that question is not a coordinate, but a structure, a pattern of possibilities that encodes how light can appear when interaction occurs. That structure is real in the sense that it predicts outcomes with extraordinary precision, but it does not correspond to a single location in space. And because of that, the concept of where stops functioning as a meaningful property. It doesn't point to anything. It doesn't reveal a hidden truth. It simply fails. And when a concept fails like that, it doesn't mean reality has become vague or undefined. It means your way of describing it has reached its limit. Because before light is seen, reality is not organized in the way your intuition expects. And the question, where is it, is no longer the right tool to understand it. Even after where stops making sense, something important remains. Because it would be easy to misunderstand all of this and think that light somehow doesn't exist before it is seen. that it appears out of nowhere at the moment of detection, as if reality is being created from nothing. But that is not what the physics is telling you. Something is there, something real, structured, and consistent. Just not something that can be pinned to a single place. Before light is observed, it still carries energy. It still follows precise rules. It still evolves in a way that can be predicted with incredible accuracy. If you repeat the same experiment over and over, the outcomes will form patterns that match those predictions perfectly. Nothing about this is random chaos or pure uncertainty. It is structured. But that structure is not a position. It is a description, not a point in space. It is a description of possibilities. And this is where a subtle but crucial distinction comes into view. In everyday thinking, existence and location are tied together. If something exists, you expect it to be somewhere. But at this level, existence becomes something slightly different. It becomes something that can be defined without being localized. Light exists as a set of allowed outcomes, as a distribution that tells you how it can appear when interaction occurs, as a pattern that evolves over time, even if that time does not correspond to a sequence of experienced moments for light itself. So before it is seen, light is not nowhere in the sense of being absent. It is nowhere in the sense of not being confined to a single place. And that difference is easy to overlook, but it changes everything, because it means that what you are dealing with is not emptiness. It is something real that simply does not fit into the framework of location. To make this more intuitive, imagine a piece of music before it is played. The notes exist. The structure exists. The relationships between sounds are fully defined. But the music is not located at a single point in space in the way an object is. It is a pattern that can manifest when the conditions are right. Light, before it is seen, is closer to that kind of existence. A structured potential, not a hidden object waiting in a specific place. And when the moment of interaction arrives, that structure expresses itself as a single outcome. One position becomes real. One event occurs. But that event is not the revelation of a pre-existing location. It is the realization of one possibility out of many, which means that what you see is not where light was. It is what light becomes when it is forced into a definite state. And everything that came before that moment remains in a different form. A form that is real, but not localized. A form that shapes the outcome, but cannot be reduced to a single point in space. So even without a where, light does not disappear into nothing. It exists in a way that challenges the very idea that existence must always have a place. And that idea, once it begins to settle in, starts to extend beyond light itself. Because if something can exist without a defined location, then where is not as fundamental as it once seemed. At this point, something subtle begins to shift in how you see the world around you, because everything you experience feels continuous. Light appears to flow smoothly through space. Objects remain visible from moment to moment. The world does not flicker in and out of existence. It does not feel like a sequence of isolated events. It feels stable, connected, uninterrupted. But that feeling is not something you directly observe. It is something your mind constructs. Every image you see is built from countless individual interactions, tiny events where light has been absorbed, reflected, or detected. Each of those events is discrete, separate, defined only at the moment it occurs. And yet, your brain takes all of those separate moments and stitches them together into a seamless experience. It fills the gaps. It removes the discontinuity. It creates the illusion of a continuous flow. So when you look across a room and feel as though light is smoothly occupying the space between you and everything you see, what you are actually experiencing is not the presence of light in between. You are experiencing the result of many interactions that have already happened, assembled into a single, coherent picture. The continuity is not in the light itself. It is in your perception of it, and this becomes important when you return to the question you started with, because that question assumes continuity. It assumes that light exists at every point along its path before it reaches you, that it fills space as it travels, that it is present in a continuous way from source to observer. But if what you perceive as continuity is something constructed after the fact, then that assumption begins to fall apart. There is no direct evidence of light existing as a continuous presence in the space between interactions. Only evidence of the outcomes. Only evidence of the moments where light becomes defined. Everything in between is inferred, reconstructed, imagined into a smooth sequence that feels natural, but may not reflect what is actually happening at a deeper level. And this is where the illusion becomes powerful, because once continuity is assumed, everything else follows naturally. Movement feels real. Paths feel real. Locations feel real. The idea that light must be somewhere at every moment feels unavoidable. But if continuity itself is not fundamental, if it is something built by your perception, then all of those conclusions begin to lose their foundation. The smooth journey you imagine is not something you directly observe. It is something your mind creates to make sense of discrete events. And that means the space between those events is not necessarily filled in the way you think. It may not contain a continuous trail of light at all. It may be something far less concrete, a region where possibilities exist without forming a continuous presence, where the idea of being there has not yet taken shape. So the next time you look at the world and feel that everything is connected by a smooth, flowing field of light, remember what you are actually seeing, not the journey, not the in-between, but the endpoints, the resolved moments, stitched together into something that feels whole, even though underneath that feeling, there may be no continuity at all. If you follow this all the way through, something quiet but profound begins to emerge. The world you see is not built from continuous things moving through space. It is built from endpoints, from moments where interactions occur, where light is absorbed, reflected, or detected, where something unresolved becomes definite. Every surface you see, every edge, every color, every detail, exists for you only because light has already reached a point of interaction and produced an outcome your brain can use. You never see light before that moment. You only ever see where it ends. And yet, your experience makes it feel like you are observing everything in between. It feels like you are looking through a fully illuminated space, as if light is continuously present along the path from object to eye. But that feeling is constructed. It is assembled from countless endpoints, arranged in such a way that they create the illusion of a filled-in world. This means that what you call seeing is not a window into an ongoing process. It is a reconstruction of completed events, a map drawn from outcomes, not from the unresolved state that existed before them. And because of that, the space between source and observer takes on a very different meaning. It is not a corridor filled with light waiting to be seen. It is a gap that is only ever revealed at its boundaries. You see where light begins. You see where light ends. But you never directly see what happens in between. And everything you believe about that in between, every path, every position, every moment of travel, is inferred from those endpoints. It is a story your mind tells to connect cause and effect into something that feels smooth and intuitive. But that story may not reflect the deeper structure of reality, because at that deeper level, there is no continuous chain of defined positions linking emission to detection. There is only a transition, a shift from possibility to outcome, and the endpoints are the only places where that outcome becomes real. So when you look at the world, you are not seeing light as it travels. You are seeing the places where its journey has already resolved. The walls around you are not filled with light in transit. They are surfaces where interactions have occurred. Your vision is not a record of continuous motion. It is a collection of final states. And your brain, incredibly efficient and seamless, takes those final states and weaves them into something that feels like a flowing, uninterrupted reality. But beneath that flow, something else is true. The world you see is not made of continuous presence. It is made of resolved events, and everything in between those events. Everything you imagine as a path, a position, a where, exists only as a reconstruction, which means that before light is seen, the world itself is not filled in the way you think. It is waiting to be resolved, one interaction at a time. There is a boundary you've been approaching this entire time, not a boundary in space, but a boundary in understanding, a point where the questions you can ask no longer line up cleanly with the way reality behaves. And when you reach that point, something unusual happens. The problem is no longer a lack of information. It becomes a mismatch between the way you think and the way things actually are. Because everything you've used to make sense of the world, location, movement, continuity, even time, has been shaped by everyday experience. It works perfectly for objects, for large scales, for anything that behaves in a stable and predictable way. But when you try to extend those same ideas down to the level where light exists before it is seen, they begin to lose their grip. Not gradually, but fundamentally. You are no longer asking questions that reality is built to answer in that form. And this is where many people instinctively try to push further, to demand a clearer picture, to ask for the exact mechanism, the hidden path, the precise description of what is really happening in the space between emission and detection. But the deeper you go, the more it becomes clear that this expectation itself may be misplaced, because the framework you are using assumes that there is a single, concrete story unfolding underneath everything, a story with defined steps, defined positions, a clear sequence of events. But what if that story does not exist in the way you expect? What if reality at this level is not built from a continuous chain of definite states, but from something more abstract, something that only becomes concrete at the moment of interaction? This is not a failure of physics. It is a reflection of its success, because the theories that describe light at this level do not break down. They make incredibly precise predictions. They match experiments with extraordinary accuracy. They tell you exactly what outcomes to expect and how those outcomes will be distributed. What they do not give you is a simple picture. They do not tell you where light is before it is seen, because that question assumes a property that may not exist in a defined way. They do not provide a hidden path you can visualize, because that path may not be part of the underlying structure. And this is where understanding shifts into something quieter, less about forcing reality into familiar shapes, more about recognizing the limits of those shapes. Because at this boundary, the goal is no longer to replace one intuitive picture with another equally simple one. It is to accept that some aspects of reality do not fit into simple pictures at all, that the absence of a clear where is not something missing. It is something real, a reflection of how things are structured at a deeper level. And once you begin to accept that, the question itself starts to feel different, less like something waiting to be answered, more like something that reveals the limits of how you are trying to understand it. Because before light is seen, you are no longer asking about a hidden location. You are standing at the edge of what location even means. By now, the original question has changed. Not on the surface. The words are still the same. Where is light before it is seen? But everything underneath those words has shifted. What once felt like a simple request for a location has turned into something else entirely. something that no longer points to a place, but to a limit. And this is where the answer begins to take shape, not as a coordinate, not as a hidden path, but as a realization, because every attempt to answer the question in the usual way leads you back to the same conclusion. Light does not occupy a single, defined position before it is observed. It does not move through space as a sequence of definite locations. It does not carry a fixed where that exists independently of interaction. And yet, something real still exists, something structured, predictable, and consistent. So the answer cannot be nowhere in the sense of absence, and it cannot be somewhere in the sense of a hidden point. It has to be something in between, something that does not fit into the categories the question was built on. This is why the answer feels unsatisfying at first, because it doesn't resolve into a clear image you can hold in your mind. It doesn't replace one intuitive picture with another. Instead, it removes the need for that picture entirely. Before light is seen, it exists as a structure of possibilities, not as a thing in a place, not as an object moving through space, but as a set of potential outcomes that only become real when interaction occurs. And that means the question, where is it, does not have a direct answer, because it is asking for something that does not exist in the way it assumes. The answer is not hidden. It is absent by definition. And this is where the realization becomes clear. The problem was never that we didn't know where light was. The problem is that we expected it to have a where at all. Because once you remove that expectation, everything else falls into place. The strange behavior of light stops being contradictory. The lack of a defined path stops being confusing. The idea that position only becomes real at the moment of interaction stops feeling like a gap in understanding and starts feeling like a natural consequence of how reality is structured at that level. And suddenly, the question no longer demands a location. It reveals a limitation in the way we think about existence, because we are used to tying existence to place. But light, before it is seen, shows you that this connection is not absolute, that something can exist without being somewhere in the way you expect. And that realization does not just answer the question, it transforms it. Because now, instead of asking where light is, you begin to understand why that question doesn't apply. Once you step back from the question itself, something larger begins to come into view. Because this was never only about light. Light is just where the cracks start to show. It is one of the first places where your everyday assumptions about position, movement, and existence stop working cleanly. But the implications do not stay confined to light. They begin to spread outward, touching the way you think about reality as a whole. Because if something can exist without having a definite location, then location is not as fundamental as it seems. If something can transition from a spread of possibilities into a single outcome only at the moment of interaction, then reality is not fully decided in the way you imagine it to be. And if the world you experience is built from resolved events, stitched together into continuity by your perception, then what feels solid and complete may be resting on something far less concrete underneath. This does not mean reality is unstable or unreal. It means it is structured differently than your intuition expects. At large scales, everything behaves in a way that allows you to rely on location, motion, and continuity. The world feels stable because, at that level, it effectively is. The deeper structure averages out into something smooth and predictable. That is the world you navigate every day. But beneath that layer, the foundation is not made of tiny objects sitting in definite places at all times. It is made of relationships, of interactions, of possibilities that only become definite when something forces them to. And light reveals this more clearly than almost anything else, because it sits right at the boundary between what you can easily understand and what begins to slip beyond intuitive grasp. It behaves in ways that still produce a stable, visible world, while quietly violating the assumptions that make that world feel straightforward. So when you ask where light is before it is seen, you are not just asking about a physical process. You are touching a deeper question about what it means for something to exist at all. Does existence require a location? Does something have to be somewhere to be real? Or can reality include forms of existence that are not tied to a single point in space? Light suggests the latter, and once that idea begins to settle in, it becomes difficult to draw a hard line around it, because if one part of reality behaves this way, it raises the possibility that this is not an exception, but a glimpse of something more general, a hint that what you experience as a fully defined world may emerge from something more open, more distributed, and more dependent on interaction than it appears. And that realization does not make the world less real. It makes it deeper, because beneath the surfaces you see, there is a structure that does not need to be somewhere in order to exist, a structure that only becomes concrete at the moment it is brought into focus. And light, before it is seen, is one of the clearest windows into that deeper layer. At some point, without noticing exactly when, your perspective begins to change. Not dramatically, not in a way that disrupts your everyday experience. The world still looks the same. Light still fills your vision. Objects remain where you expect them to be. Nothing about your direct perception collapses or becomes unstable. But underneath that stability, something has shifted, because you no longer take the continuity for granted. You no longer assume that what you see is a direct reflection of what exists at every moment between events. Instead, you begin to recognize that what feels like a smooth, uninterrupted reality is built from something more discrete, more structured, and less tied to fixed positions than it appears. And once you see that, it's difficult to fully go back, because the simple picture, the one where light is always somewhere, always moving along a path, always occupying space in a continuous way, no longer feels complete. It still works at a surface level. It still describes what you experience, but you know now that it is a layer, not the foundation, a useful description, not the full story. So when you look at the world, there is a subtle awareness in the background, an understanding that what you are seeing is not the journey of light itself, but the result of interactions that have already happened. That the space between those interactions is not something you directly observe, but something your mind fills in. And that awareness does something interesting. It creates a kind of quiet distance between perception and reality, not in a way that disconnects you from the world, but in a way that adds depth to it. You begin to sense that there is more happening beneath the surface than what is immediately visible. That the clarity you experience is not the absence of complexity, but the result of it being resolved. And this shift does not just apply to light. It begins to extend outward. Because if what you see is built from endpoints from resolved events, then everything you perceive carries that same structure. Every moment of clarity sits on top of something that was, just before it became real, undefined in the way you expect. A range of possibilities, a structure that had not yet collapsed into a single outcome. And that realization changes the way you relate to the question you started with. Because now asking, where is light before it is seen, no longer feels like a question that needs a location as an answer. It feels like a doorway, a way of revealing that some aspects of reality are not built from fixed positions at all. That where is something that emerges, not something that always exists. And once that idea settles in, even quietly, it reshapes how you think about presence itself. Because what feels immediate, solid, and continuous may be something that only becomes that way at the moment you encounter it. And everything before that moment, everything you cannot directly see, exists in a different form, not absent, not hidden, but not yet defined in the way your intuition expects. And that is the shift, subtle, but impossible to fully undo. At the beginning, the question felt simple. Where is light before it is seen? It sounded like something that should have a clear answer, a point in space, a position along a path, somewhere between the moment it leaves a source and the moment it reaches your eyes. Something you could imagine, something you could place, something you could understand in the same way you understand everything else that moves through the world. But step by step, that picture began to fall apart. The path dissolved. The idea of a continuous journey gave way to something less defined. The notion of a fixed position faded into a spread of possibilities. Time itself shifted, revealing that for light, there may be no experienced in-between at all. And your own perception turned out not to be a direct window into that process, but a reconstruction built from the final moments where everything becomes definite. And now, at the end of that path, the answer looks very different from what you expected. Before light is seen, it is not somewhere in the way you imagined. It is not traveling through space as a sequence of defined locations. It is not waiting at a hidden point to be discovered. Instead, it exists as a structure of possibilities, a distribution that encodes how it can appear when interaction occurs. Something real, but not localized. Something that evolves, but not through a series of fixed positions. Something that becomes aware only at the moment it is forced to be one. And that is why the question cannot be answered in the way it was asked. Because where is not a property that applies in that state. It is something that emerges, something that comes into existence at the moment light is seen. So when you ask where light is before it reaches your eyes, the most honest answer is not a location. It is a shift in understanding. Before it is seen, there is no single place for it to be. There is only the potential for a place to appear, and that does not make light less real. It makes reality itself more subtle than it first seemed. Because what you experience as a fully defined world is built on something that, just before it becomes visible, is not yet there in the way you think. If this changed the way you think, even slightly, then you're starting to see what this channel is really about. Not just learning physics, but slowly uncovering how reality actually behaves beneath the surface of what feels obvious. If you want more of these deep, calm explorations, questions that stay with you long after the video ends, make sure to subscribe to Science Sleep Theory. And before you go, let me know in the comments. What do you think reality looks like before it becomes something you can see? Take a moment, let that question settle, and I'll see you in the next one.